Welcome to part 2 of this riveting scene design lecture, and you have the history of scenery. I know everybody's favorite subject. So let me go ahead and start with a disclaimer that history is long, time is long, and people did lots and lots of stuff that was not recorded. So although this is going to be a brief rundown of the history of scenery and kind of theatrical buildings and how that affects scenery and the audience's perception of scenery, this is by no means a comprehensive view of the history of scenery throughout time. There is a lot more to it, including props and painting and all sorts of things that we're not going to cover today. But there's a reason why theater history is split into two entirely different classes for you, and there's no possible way that I'm going to cover all of that today. But, I'll try valiantly. So here we go. How did we get to where we are now? Let's start back in ye old ancient Greece, where we have the amphitheater. And the amphitheater itself in ancient Greek times didn't start as this full out thing. It had audiences as a particular shape, and then it got a small skene, and then it got a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. That flat scene, skene, or facade it grew. It was an image once, and then it was a small image and a building kind of far away, and actors would just kind of skitter off to that building and change their costumes and come back. But the actual building grew and grew, but it still didn't really give the overall impression of blocking out the rest of the city. They had lots of stage machinery. They particularly loved flying machinery and loved flying people and essentially throwing people up into the air on a long stick of craziness. But their big addition to the world of theater was periactoids. And periactoids looked a little something, or functioned a little something like this. You have the audience on one side, and let's say that this red line is the fiery mountain scene, and it's a painted scene on 3 different flats, and these flats could be attached similarly like they are here, or they could be in 3 separate holes inside the facade behind the action of the play. And they had a central pivot that these triangles turned on. So when they turned, they would all turn at the same time in the same direction, and then you'd see the next scene, let's say a forest scene represented by brown. And the next scene may be ocean blue, so we could turn to the ocean blue in the next scene. Or we could always turn back to the fiery mountain scene, the volcano scene, or whatever we chose that to be, right? And this system, this periactoid, was so prevalent that it was still used in the Italian Renaissance, literally hundreds of years later, almost 2,000 years after this was invented. So this was a relatively prevalent piece of theater, aside from the fact that, inventing theater was pretty pervasive as well. I don't want you to think that ancient Greek theater didn't also have some other things that Roman theaters had as well. They had pits and trapdoors in lower areas, and they had second stories to their skene, but they weren't as popular in ancient Greece as they were in ancient Rome. Ancient Rome put second stories on that facade like nobody's business. They built it bigger and badder, as they often do, where they take Greek things and just went, boom, let's make it bigger. For instance, the theater in Pompeii had an overall diameter of the audience circle here was absolutely humongous, and it was around 500 feet in diameter. And then the circle of the stage itself was 300 feet long, or this back stage-like area was 300 feet long in Pompeii. That's pretty darn big. And that is one of their permanent theaters. They didn't build permanent theaters that often. In true Roman style, they like to barge in and take over other people's theaters. So they actually went in and took over Greek theaters and knocked some stuff down and built on top of it and made it bigger, better, awesome, faster, stronger. But they didn't like to build theaters themselves. Romans were very superstitious, and they believed in not only their own gods, but they believed in other people's gods. For instance, when they invaded cities, they would pray to the gods of the people in that city. that they prayed to. So if in that city they prayed to Bob the god, before the Romans invaded that city, they would pray to Bob the god. And if they believed that if they conquered that city, Bob the god was totally on their side now, and or had abandoned its people and fled because their gods were bigger and better and the Romans were to be respected. But if they lost, they thought they had been triumphed by that god, and they, went on. So the the Romans didn't like the idea of building a theater, which was also kind of a temple to a god, and then putting on a play, which again was often a tribute to a god in another god's house. You really can't do a whole play about um, the god John inside the god Bob's theater. That's just passe, and they wouldn't want to incur bad favor from the gods. And again, since they believed in other people's gods, that was difficult. They also had lots of gods in their own pantheon for that particular difficulty to happen. But if they conquered a city, like a Greek city, then they conquered that city and they conquered the gods involved. So they took over a lot more permanent theaters than they built. Yeah. So they also painted their facade. Rome was known for a lot of trompe-l'oeil, beautiful paintings, and they painted their facades in some areas as well. Obviously, the Greeks painted some facades because they invented the periactoid, but they didn't do a whole lot of painting. And Greek painting, when I say they didn't do a lot of painting, I mean they didn't do trompe-l'oeil realistic painting. And by that I mean Greece was painting representational pictures to the god Bob, not painting a idea of what Bob's heavenly house would look like. So if you were in a forest in an ancient Greek play, you might have a couple of trees or a single tree painted on the periactoid. In Rome, you may have something that looks like a realistic forest with a bunch of trees overlapping and some atmospheric depth to it. And that's kind of the difference between those two, right? The Romans had a whole lot of moving scenery. They liked that a lot. They were still big on the flying machinery, the big stick to throw people up in the air with. But I should mention that the emperor did not like to see people die. So keeping in mind that this was very unsafe and actors are essentially just kind of lazily strapped to a piece of wood that flies them in the air. Also, if they fell off and died during a production, um, or were significantly hurt during a production, that was the fault of the scene designer or the technician. So, yeah, they were put in the gladiatory pits, so you probably had to be pretty good at your job. The Other than that, they were really big on magic and moving platforms and moving things, and they had whole under pits that were designed so that they could hide what they were doing. They hid their magic a little bit more than they did with Greek theater, including that facade wall that we're looking at right now. That is intended to hide the city from the audience. So we're already starting to focus in on the world rather than just, yeah, here's something kind of pretty to look at, but don't look at the city. And now we're actually blocking the city out from the sightlines of the audience. One of the things you want to remember is that this was definitely not the only entertainment medium for Rome, and not necessarily even the primary ones. They often had circuses that had chariot races, and they would flood a lot of their entertainment venues and have mock battles and that kind of thing. So they definitely were not restricted to just traditional theater. Once you get past Greece and Rome, you get into medieval times. And as we all know, medieval times starts with the Dark Ages, the Dark Ages being the time where we lost a whole lot of information, not the time where it was particularly dark. Does this picture look dark? This picture doesn't look dark. It does look gothic. So uh, the thing that happened during the Dark Ages is that we lost a lot of writing, people became very illiterate, and we also lost a lot of institutional memory. So how we did theater got kind of lost, and we had to reinvent the wheel, as what happened with a lot of other things as well. In this time, theater has also lost a whole lot of public support and public favor. It's no longer the go-to medium for entertainment. You were working really hard and you were trying to feed a large population of people, and you were also trying to go to church. And church was trying very hard to scare you into staying in church and giving them money. So, one of the things that the churches noticed is that that these theater folk were getting very nomadic. There were lots of travelers and traveling theater troops, and their congregation couldn't read. So, let's put these two together and get them educated. So, theatrical productions moved inside churches, and the architecture of churches provided a native set of scenery. They didn't hang any drops or bring in very much flats or very many props or very many chairs or things like that. They used the platforms, the dais, the altar, and the general beautiful backdrop of the church to work on telling the stories of Scripture. At this particular point, it became very important that magic was hidden. You do not want to see Jesus going up on the crucifixion cross with a big old rope, like like being pulled by a bunch of hunking men in the back, trying to get him straight up into the air. That was not going to fly with the church. They wanted this to be magical. They wanted the entire story to have that magic be divine rather than visible. So we really get that part where we're trying to make that machinery not visible. Theater starts to move outside again as you get church festivals that go outside, and you get a larger acceptance of the passion play, and we start putting building scenery entirely instead of using the native scenery of churches toward the later Middle Ages. Remember that the Middle Ages was from the 5th to the 15th century, and that's a really long time to just have one tiny little category. But we started to have pageant wagons, so we would build an entire thing of scenery and put it on wheels and roll it around. And there are a couple of different ways that you can do this, but basically each wagon was its own scene or location. And these scenes or locations went along in an order to tell a story. And you could have processional staging or fixed staging. And fixed staging is where the stage stood still and the people came in and looked at the play and then left, came in, looked at the scene, and then left and went to the next one, so forth and so on. While processional staging was like a parade, and you had the long line of carts rolling their way through a city center and playing their scenes at different stops into different groups of people as they go. These were relatively simple to relatively elaborate, different types of staging, and different types of stages. We get into the Renaissance, and remember that the Renaissance, which has kind of Shakespeare as stages, the Renaissance is not like this moment. These aren't hugely defined labels where there were big banners up that says we are in the era called the Middle Ages. Oh, now that this year has clicked over, we're in the Renaissance. That didn't happen. So you have Renaissance spreading slowly across different areas, and one of the things you get in Shakespeare theaters is a very pageant wagon-esque theater, because if you look at the basis of this stage and the flat skinny in the back and the place at the top in order to have machinery and a pit at the bottom in order to have trap doors and machinery, this looks an awful lot like a large pageant wagon. It's just a big version of that and also very similar to the institutional memory of the amphitheater. The only real big difference is now we're committing to essentially a fixed stage, and we're committing to a single stage and bringing small things in and out, and we're having our audience stay there, and we build them some permanent seating. We do, however, start a trend of pulling everything very close to the stage. So our audience, we want them close to be able to see the people on stage, to be able to see what's going on, and we're not pushing them really far away and accommodating as many people as the amphitheater might do. Theater really isn't the only method of entertainment still. This change is also fueled by Elizabeth I. So the Tudor queen, when she comes into power, is really in demanding, brings into demand for less religious theater. She wants to push that to be less secular, partially because of the religious tension between Catholics and Protestants that plagues that area of time in England and other parts of Europe. But essentially, the idea that theater can be more about entertainment starts to become popular again, and secular stories start to become more interesting. So we're looking at going there for entertainment and going to churches for different reasons. So the size capacity is very different. Then we move into the Italian Renaissance, which is much more Renaissance-y looking than the English Renaissance of this kind of pageant wagon-esque stage. We get our first introduction to perspective and picture plane. So the idea of this is that we have a linear and aerial perspective moving backs, and this is when we really start to solidify the idea of the rules of linear perspective. And they almost always use a single point of perspective so that the wings, these little side pieces, are wings, just like what we always call wings, and they're painted in perspective toward the back where there's a drop. And that those combined together are what we call wing and drop scenery. So very little three-dimensional pieces. Mostly we're looking at things in perspective on the sides of the stage leading back. We also, they could be at fixed positions or angled toward the backs, or they could be changeable. And we're still using the ancient Greek periactoids, and we would put them on a pivot, and you could do 3 different types of scenery with those same wings. And to change the backdrop, they would have large shutters, like French doors or shutters on a window, which you may have never seen in your life, but French doors. So they would close and open those doors to have different backdrops in the back. The perspective in Italian Renaissance theater is extremely innovative and interesting, but it also means that focusing audiences more toward the front rather than around the stage becomes more important, because you can't really see the perspective and you're not fooled by it if you're not in front of the stage. So it pushes us from more arena style theater to a proscenium style theater. We also get a little bit more of a frame coming around the stage by that first set of legs, and border will create something like a proscenium, but we don't actually have full-fledged prosceniums per se. They're still painted pieces of scenery that match the rest of what's going on. We just, we don't call it a proscenium, and it isn't really a proscenium yet. All right, so in the 1700s, 18th century, early 1800s, we don't get a lot of innovation as far as theaters and scenery goes. We do get a continuation of the same thing, right? So we're continuing with perspective, we're continuing with wing and drop, but we start to get opera. And opera becomes really over the top, important, elaborate, interesting. We're still using perspective to make that opera and make that scenery, but we're creating impossible images that are extremely fantastical. They use traps and sliding scenery a lot. They use elevators, they use things like that. But flying machines finally become passé. Like the reason today that we don't have flying people in every single show for no particular reason is because in the 18th century it started to get kind of uncool, finally. Only took 2,000 years, no big deal. And they did have really large scenery, and under the stage started to become really important for scenery moving. In the 19th century is much the same, except that in Italy it became all about opera. In other areas of the world, English changes. Should have mentioned this before. In the Italian Renaissance, with the perspective, is when we start to get rake stages. The perspective gives us a rake stage. That's where we start to get that. So you're looking at around the 1600s, we get a rake stage coming on the scene, and that continues to persist through the 1700s and the 1800s, right? And before we move on to realism, some of what sparks that is gaslighting and panoramic photography. So we start getting gaslighting, which gives us control. Technology is giving us more interest and control and revolutionizing what we put on stage. And panoramic photography, one, it's photography. So we start to get interested in the representation of real things. And we also get interested in a very wide horizontal shot instead of a square or vertical shot. Okay, so moving on to starting at around the 1850s, after the early 1800s, we get realism. So about 1850 to 1900. And again, we've had rake stages for since about 1600 by now. So it's like 250 years of rake stage. We finally start to get our first flat floor. We get a push toward authentic materials. Excuse me. We get a push toward authentic materials, garments, natural backgrounds, textures, and colors. And we get the inventions that really start hiding effects. And what I mean by that is we may have a painted floor. There's a specific trap called the Corsican trap, and it's also called the ghost glide. And it was really cool. They had like two pieces that made a trap in the floor, and one was bristles like a broom that were really carefully painted to look just like the floor. And then underneath you had like a roll top desk line of wood pieces together, and you'd roll that out of the way and push a person up through the bristles so they would just appear out of nowhere on the floor. So the first time we're looking at like a hole in the floor that's a trap, but we don't see the hole, and that's kind of big and important. All of this leads us toward a sense of realism. That sense of realism is where we start to get a room on stage in its entirety, beginning to end, and we call this a box set. It's essentially an enclosed box or an enclosed room where the fourth wall is the audience that we're looking at from the audience point of view through that hole, right? This sense of realism does not start out as super duper realism. It starts out as kind of an idea toward realism and gets more and more and more intense. So Richard Wagner, the composer guy for opera, Ring Cycle, etc. He embraced the idea of life as a myth maker. And he was once quoted as saying that drama should be dipped in the magic fountain of music. And he did not think that everything should be a record of life, but that was mostly a reaction to intense realism and what we call naturalism, which is a sense that everything is so carefully laid out and planned and perfectly placed to be exactly the way it would be in real life. Everything is exactly as dirty as it would be in real life. There are really that many books, really that many pieces of paper, and there are degrees of this, from a stylized realism that has some realistic textures or realistic effects, but it's just represented realism, versus getting all the way toward hyper-realism, which is employing a lot more realistic effects, toward naturalism, which would be if they eat on stage, they eat on stage. If they sleep on stage, then they're sleeping on stage. We're not going to skip around. You're getting all the real stuff. So if, for instance, they slaughter a chicken on stage, they're going to slaughter a chicken on stage. This historical accuracy that was thought in the beginning of the century was not hyper-realism. So we start to slowly migrate toward it. We advance gauze, scrim, smoke, cut drops, things like that. And as we move through, we get more and more closer to realism, naturalism. As we get into the 1900s or the 20th century, we get modernism, which is really, in a lot of ways, a reaction to World War I, and we get symbolism, expressionism, and many, many other isms. But one of the things about modernism is it's an anti-realism movement. We went way too far into the realism sector of the world. Now we're pushing back with anti-realism. things start falling apart that would never, it's portraying a world where things could fall apart because these things do not readily exist in reality. Meaning that as we move away from realism, this idea of novelty or innovation becomes more valued than just the duplication of reality. And it becomes respected next to the replication of everyday life, that slice of life ideal. So you have things like this picture, which would be symbolism, where you have individual things representing bigger things or bigger concepts or ideas, and rather than specifically showing them. So parts of scenery that relate or pieces that represent places, separate places, rather than exhaustively describe a single place. Symbolism was also known for having some characteristic qualities and working in concert with representing places, as well as representing clothing. Expressionism was a sense of focus on the internal spirit rather than materialism. So it was invoking a feeling of the play or place rather than trying to inform an exact, necessarily real location. All of these isms are really about designing space in terms of space, volume, mass, and using platforms, steps, and ramps to create transitions in space between the horizontal and the vertical. Before this, especially when you're looking at wing and drop scenery, you're looking at very vertical verticals and very horizontal horizontals. And even when you're looking at realistic sets and realistic spaces, we have a lot of floors and a lot of walls and not a lot of ramps in our lives. So if you think about an actual apartment or home that you've ever lived in, are there platforms and steps and sunken living rooms and all sorts of levels everywhere in your home? Probably not. I mean, they appear on TV sitcoms because they're designed that way, but in general, there aren't that many levels. These are stylized representations of realistic places, and where that artistic license to stylize comes from is this modernism idea in the 20th century. And so we have the isms to thank for that. Also, this kind of templative idea that every play is a problem to be solved, and solving it now has many directions. Solving it can be representative, solving it can be symbolic, solving it can be expressing yourself, solving it can be showing the backstage, solving it can be not showing the backstage. This becomes an entirely new and different way of thinking, and it begins to fragment our theater culture into many different, all perfectly adequate directions. Our last segment is going to be post-World War II to the present. And you have a lot of breaking. So you have epic theater and the kind of weird transition, which is continuation of symbolism, expressionism, and epic theater particularly is breaking the convention that we don't see the backstage or see actors off stage, and we often see a lot of that. So it's this drastic swing back to seeing the trick, right? So almost all the way back to ancient Greece, where we can see the machine lifting that guy up, we see the baton lifting that guy up. And this idea of seeing the tricks is giving us a break in convention that is similar to symbolism and expressionism and other types of modernism. And it is part of the reaction to the overly real violence that happened in World War II. During the 20th and 21st century, we get a whole lot of innovation. We get a rapid mechanical development, right? So we go from having basic counterweight technology to the technological advances that just change the face of theater. Without electricity and lighting to change location, we didn't have nearly as much control as what we're really used to having today. And as soon as we got control of individual lighting instruments, we also got control of space in a way that we hadn't had before. We had dimmer control, had a lot of other things. But as soon as we get computer control and individual control of instruments before that, we get the ability to actually light two different things, which doesn't seem innovative, but it is. Congruent scenery, like two scenes happening at the same time in the same space, doesn't actually happen until the 1930s. Before we talk about that, rapid mechanical development also applies to scenery as well as lights. These surfaces are projected, and the scenery there is extremely heavy and can turn in many different directions. And all of these pieces are independently controlled. And when I'm talking about congruent scenes, I'm talking about two different locations or two different things happening at the same time on stage, and isolating them with light is a trick that we do rather often. And we can build two completely different sets for them, and we did that, and we did that a lot in musicals. But I think there's a reason that musicals don't show up until really the golden age of musicals, because we didn't really start having congruent scenes take place on stage at the same time until around the 1930s. You have a whole lot of reevaluation that goes on in the world of theater after the war. You have Germany, which rethinks its tradition in staging. They're questioning their ideology. Their scenery is tending to stimulate the imagination of the audience rather than provide actual images of actual places. They're more concerned with representing things and treating a place as a reality to be examined, not a reality that has occurred. So they're trying to provoke thought, especially after what they've been through. England is known for pouring resources into arts and typically just valuing the arts a whole lot more. Artistic expression and innovation over entertainment becomes a huge step forward in that country because they're pouring so many resources into it. They're experimenting with theater, they're finding new things, and their theater advances quite a bit. The United States gives us Broadway, which ends up being a logical, easy to follow, but visually interesting story. And a lot of the times they're grounded in realism or modernism, but it's a modified realism and it's based in spectacle and excitement. The other thing that several countries, including the United States, goes towards is this kind of abstract deconstructionism. And by that, I mean where we're taking something and instead of just representing a real time and a real place, and this particular show, that picture is West Side Story. And so it isn't New York, but it is New York. And it's kind of representing a place and a time, but it's in an abstract way. And when I say deconstruction, I think that is partially because it also relates to the artistic and architectural deconstruction movement. And this kind of contrast and juxtaposition between soft and hard serves to have a really interesting visual medium. And so that about brings us up to now. So you'll have a lot of times where you'll be talking about abstract design or design which has a bunch of congruent scenes with each other, or design which has musical wagons coming in and out of stage. And it's important to remember that all of these scenic concepts came from the history of scenic design. And we have essentially had the tools at our disposal for a really long time. It's doing original and insightful and inspiring things with them now that is going to make something look very upbeat and modern, or make someone think, rather than thinking that you have to reinvent the wheel. Especially when you consider that a projected backdrop is still just a backdrop. It isn't anything more that can be done without a painted piece of scenery that you just change out. Now that we've talked about the history of theater, part 3 will be about some of the categories of design and breaking these into the kinds of scenery that we see today.